Hey guys, I'm Thomas, and welcome back to Stylized Station. And today, we're going to try and give Super Mario a domain expansion. I started creating a simple scene where I animated the camera to pull back, revealing a giant meteor, which then crashes down into the ground. And then I animated a sphere to expand at the moment of impact to simulate the scale of the explosion. Looking pretty good so far. Blocking out the entire scene first was extremely helpful. I had made a basic storyboard this time around to help me avoid any mistakes like last time, and I was determined to stick to it. And yes, the victim of this scene is going to be an innocent Goomba, but more on that later. In Mario's domain expansion, I wanted a power that enhanced the power-ups from the games and made them ridiculously overpowered. I played around with a few ideas, like upgrading the 1-up mushroom into the colossal mushroom, which would transform Mario into a skyscraper-sized monster with Godzilla-like abilities. But I thought of something even better. I wanted to upgrade the little dinky fire flower power-up and transform it into the meteor flower, which lets Mario summon a massive meteor that smashes into the ground and creates a city-sized explosion. How hard could it be? Turns out extremely hard, but we'll get into that. Anyway, I wanted to focus on scale, so I created a bunch of cylinders and duplicated them around to make a makeshift city. Now we can get a better sense of how big this explosion is going to be. I was feeling confident, but my newly inflated ego was about to cost me my first fatal mistake, because not even 20 minutes into my new project, I had started deviating from my story. Apparently, my cool idea wasn't cool enough, so I made an on-the-fly decision to add a shot where Mario is going to float up into the air before sending out the meteor to our unsuspecting friend. This may have seemed like a good idea at the time, but little did I know these changes were going to cause serious problems later. Now, I have a short attention span, so I got bored of working on the blockout. I decided to start working on the flaming meteor instead, because this time, I was pretty confident I could nail the look. First, I drew a pretty terrible flame texture. Not going great so far, but I was about to do something interesting. In my last video, I learned how to use distortion to add some movement to my textures, and honestly, it was a game changer. Instead of using lightning, this time I wanted to try and use distortion to make fire. So I used a swirly texture as my distortion. Then I took a lerp node to add some color, and wow, this looks pretty horrific, but I can see that this has some potential. So I spent a few hours working on fire textures until I was happy. I like how this one turned out. It looks pretty intense, and the distortion texture adds so much fluidity and movement to it. Now I have a solid fire texture for my meteor. I'm gonna call this one a win. Now, I was still too scared to start tackling the rest of my scene, so I kept on experimenting with my meteor. I tried adding a rock texture, and I tried adding some wind lines, but since I only created a rough storyboard and no actual references, I was essentially taking shots in the dark. Lesson learned. Nothing after this point was really working, which looking back makes a lot of sense. This was another important lesson that I'm gonna have to learn time and time again. Simple is almost always best. I had a solid looking meteor and I didn't need to change it at this point, so I decided to move on to the main explosion. I wanted the main explosion to feel as powerful as possible, so I started thinking to myself, what's the most powerful kind of explosion that I can think of? And then it hit me. Nukes are the most powerful explosions known to mankind, and I wanted to take a stab at creating one to push myself creatively. But there's just one small problem. I have no idea how to make one in 3D. I've never attempted anything at this scale at all, in fact. I knew that this was going to be a huge challenge, and I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to do it. But over the weekend, I was doing some reading, and I learned about something that might help me called world position offset, or as the 3D community affectionately calls it, WPO. WPO is a function in Unreal Engine that allows you to manipulate the vertices of a mesh. You can do this with simple math, but you can also use textures, and I like textures. And this gave me an idea. A nuclear explosion has these massive undulating clouds, and I knew that if I could nail this look, that the rest of this nuke would be pretty easy to make. And I just might have a shot at making this work. So I made a pretty simple node setup in Unreal Engine, and I used the WBO function to displace the vertices. Then by scrolling the texture, I was able to create a pretty decent looking material. And then I threw it into my map as a quick test, and it looked awesome. I was super happy with the results. And now I know what I have to do next. I hopped into Blender and modeled the 3 parts of the nuke: the base, the shaft, and the massive mushroom cloud. I then set up the UVs so that the textures would scroll all in the right direction. I wanted to make sure this mesh gets distorted properly, so I subdivided the mesh to make sure it has lots of vertices. Now there should be lots of detail when I distort the mesh. Then I spent the next hour tweaking the shape of the nuke and making sure everything was up to my personal incredibly high standards. Then I added the material to the mesh and I had a nuke. I was feeling extremely proud of myself. I felt the design was simple but still conveyed the feeling of a real nuke. And most importantly, I had learned an amazing new technique that I can use in my future videos. So I added the nuke mesh to my animation and animated it to grow quickly at the moment of impact. I loved it, and I felt like nothing could stop me from finishing this project. And then I hit a wall. For the next few days, I didn't make much progress. I tried adding a few things here and there, but nothing was sticking. With each passing day, I grew more and more frustrated with myself. Dark thoughts started entering my brain. Am I a horrible artist? Why can't I do anything right? Is this going to be a good project my fans are going to enjoy? I didn't know where else to go. I was lost. So I spent the day binging episodes of Jujutsu Kaisen for inspiration. And that's when it hit me. I realized I was trying to make something cool for my viewers, but what was missing and what makes a good domain expansion is the story behind it. A domain expansion is a big revealing moment and reveals a lot about the character. I'd been working backwards the whole time, and that's when I realized I had to turn Super Mario into a villain. And this is where everything began to fall into place. I wrote out a quick script where a terrifying Mario corners a terrified Goomba, and in a cinematic climax reveals his domain, Super Evil Mario World, a twisted and sinister wasteland dimension that grants himself almost unlimited power. Oh yeah, this was going to be good. Then I used Canva to sketch out a proper storyboard to get a feel if this animation was going to work or not. Oh yeah, this was gonna be real good. Now we had a villain, a victim, and an epic moment. I knew in my bones that if I could pull this off, I'd have something that I was truly proud of. I no longer had just a cool effect, I had a vision. So let's get back to work. I wanted to start this thing off right, so I knew I needed an actual 3D model of Mario to throw into my scene. So I stole this guy's N64 Super Mario model off Sketchfab and slapped him into Unreal Engine. Thanks, Sonic Voir. Your contribution will never be forgotten. My plan was going to go like this. I had a decent ending with what I've already made, but I wanted to create a few opening shots where you could really get to see how insane and terrifying Mario is. But there's one problem. If you've seen my previous videos, you guys know that I'm still terrified of animation. But this time, I wasn't going to let that stop me. I know that if I want to improve as an artist, I need to get over this fear at some point. So I slapped on my big boy pants and spent a few hours off screen creating a pretty awful rig for the Mario model. But hey, it works. Now I had a model, a rig, and a plan, and I could get to work. I ended up having a ton of fun modeling animations in Blender. I animated a little head tilt, and I also made an animation where he clasps his hands together at the start of his domain expansion. And then I exported those animations and added them into Unreal Engine, where I added some simple camera work. I even started playing around with the lighting. I was having a blast, and I was starting to realize that animation wasn't really that scary. It was actually very satisfying and rewarding. I've always had a dream of making amazing animation and VFX, so today I felt like I've taken one tiny but very important step in that direction. After a few hours of hard work, I had the first part of my animation blockout finished, and I was feeling pretty proud of myself. I really liked that floating animation idea from earlier, so I made sure to properly integrate it into my new storyboard. So I ended up creating this awesome little animation where Mario stretches out his arms and floats up into the air, very menacing-like. I wanted to emphasize this moment where he flies up into the air. It's a moment where Mr. Goomba really realizes he's upstream without a paddle. You're in evil Mario's world now, and he's in control. So I animated a few shots to drag out the moment and make it feel more cinematic and suspenseful and intense. This is what I love about having a solid plan. I knew what my shots were going to be, so I got to spend a lot of time playing around with the camera angles and movement to get the shots how I like them. Anyway, I now had pretty much all of my shots blocked out. But I had another problem. All of my shots were in different sequences. I thought that I had made another massive blunder, but then I learned a cool trick for Unreal Engine that I'm gonna share with you. Make a new sequence and call it master. And then all you have to do is take your other sequences and drag them into the master sequence. Then all of the shots will automatically play back to back in one organized sequence. Super handy trick. You are welcome. Now that the proverbial ball was rolling, I was feeling pretty good. I wanted to add a little more VFX to my meteor and nuke to push them a little bit further. So I took a sprite and made it lay flat on the ground and animated it so that it quickly expands out. So now when my meteor makes contact with the ground, the edges start to glow a little bit. I know there's a way to do this more programmatically with nodes, and I'd like to try it out in a future video, but for now, this is definitely going to work. I tried adding things like an impact shockwave and a few other things, but it didn't really work, so I ended up dropping it. Next, I animated the nuke material to glow really brightly at the moment of detonation and get less bright over time. Nuclear explosions sometimes have those massive shockwave rings that shoot out, and I wanted mine to have the same thing, so I made some really simple rings in Blender. And then I made a simple texture in Photoshop by blurring a thick line. But the rings needed animation, so I made them expand quickly after the nuke goes off. To finish it off, I added one more giant sprite under the nuke to fake some more glow, and now our nuke is looking more nukey. But Thomas, you're probably saying, aren't you forgetting something? You still have to make the actual domain, Super Evil Mario World. Well, I was saving that for right now, so thank you for reminding me. This time around, I wanted to build the environment procedurally. Luckily, Unreal Engine has a new system called PCG, which is a way to build entire environments using just nodes, and I like nodes. But before I show you how I did it, we need to make some assets to populate this environment. So I spent a day in Blender and created a few assets. I even learned a bit about procedural texturing in Blender, and it was a ton of fun until I realized that I can't import Blender shaders into Unreal Engine, so that all of my work was basically for nothing. Anyway, once all of the assets were done, I imported them into Unreal Engine and used the PCG system to distribute the assets all over my environment. The control I had was astonishing. I was able to control the size of everything, making the rocks really small and the hills and boxes and all the other things super huge. I could randomize all the rotations and even add Niagara VFX procedurally to the scene as well if I wanted. After a few quick minutes, I had my entire landscape littered with Super Mario assets, making it look almost like a wasteland, which is exactly what I was going for. pretty incredible. We're starting to get close to the finish line, but I need to do a few more things. I had completely forgotten to add our victim, Mr. Goomba, into the animation. You see, Mr. Goomba is a pivotal character in my scene. The reason I'm calling this animation Mario's Revenge is because I like to think that Mr. Goomba had killed Mario's wife in a fit of rage, driving Mario to the edge of insanity. Anyway, I needed a Goomba model. I was going to model him myself, but then I came across Perfection. This guy had already made the perfect Mr. Goomba. I mean, look at him. He looks terrified by default. I don't even need to animate this guy's face. His eyes are literally bulging out of his head. What a find. I threw our petrified Portobello into Blender and animated him to shake violently, and honestly, he looks pretty funny. Then I finally replaced the sphere and added Mr. Goomba into our shots. And he looks pretty terrified. It's a simple animation and a simple shot, but I'm extremely happy with it. And after a few tweaks, I had a lot of the shots figured out. And I knew I had something pretty interesting on my hands. At this point, I was ready to put the finishing touches on this monster project. Now, my scene was lacking some environmental VFX, so I drew a custom sprite, gave it an orange glow, and animated hundreds of them to float around in the wind, mimicking embers. Next, I repurposed the rocks I made for the environment and animated them to float up into the air when Mario starts to rise off the ground to make the moment a little more cinematic. In my previous videos, I've always drawn custom wind textures and scrolled them across a mesh to fake wind. That makes me some pretty nice wind lines, but I felt like that wouldn't be a good fit for this project. I wanted the dust kicked up by all the chaos to be a little more volumetric and have slightly more realism. So I took a simple dust sprite and animated a bunch of them to fly off in a direction. When you combine lots of them, it sort of looks like one big dust cloud. I strategically placed my new dust VFX in a few key moments. One was the moment before the meteor hits, and then I added a second dust cloud to appear in front of the camera a few moments after the final nuclear explosion, to sell the feeling that the blast was really far away. Looking back, I can't believe I got this animation finished. But I had learned so much over my last few projects, and I wanted to create something that challenged myself. And oh boy, was this animation challenging. I had never come so close to giving up in my life, but I'm so proud of myself that I pushed through. And I hope that if you learned one thing from my personal journey, it's that failure is simply the most vital part of the artistic process. Overcoming your challenges is the only way to grow and move forward as an artist. I mean, look at me. I'm the world's worst animator. I never thought in my wildest dreams that I'd be talking to you after making an animation that was almost an entire minute long. But here we are. Now, all that was missing was to add some camera shake at key moments of the animation, some sound design, and
dances with the devil. Your power isn't special. We don't fit on your canvas. We burn it all to ashes now. 'Cause we are the outlaws.